I'm going to be talking about some work I've been doing looking at risk factors for ovarian cancer and thinking about how an understanding of the epidemiology can help us to further our understanding of the origins of some cancers. And I'll be looking particularly at the exposure tubal ligation. So just for some background, ovarian cancer is about the fourth greatest cause of cancer death in UK women, and the 5-year survival is only about 30%, partly because the majority of women already have advanced stage disease at diagnosis. And there have been attempts to try and improve this by developing screening programs, but as you know, at the moment we don't have a screening program for ovarian cancer. We know from various epidemiological studies some of the risk factors for ovarian cancer, many of which are reproductive. So, for example, there's a reduced risk of ovarian cancer amongst women who've had a tubal ligation, amongst women who've had children, and amongst women who've used the oral contraceptive pill. And evidence from the Million Women study was very important in the latter. We also know that there's an increased risk of ovarian cancer with increased body size and amongst women who use menopausal hormones. And again, evidence from the Million Women study was very important in that. That's not working. Fine. So one of the factors that we hadn't looked at in Million Women study data before was tubal ligation. And there's been an increasing interest in this amongst ovarian cancer researchers recently. So tubal sterilization, tubal ligation, is when the fallopian tubes are occluded, generally by being cut or clipped. And we asked about this amongst women in our recruitment questionnaire. And so this is done for permanent contraception. Just to illustrate the anatomy for anyone who needs an update. So we have the uterus here, we have the cervix, the uterus is lined by endometrium, and then we have the fallopian tubes which go out to the ovary with the fimbrial ends. And I'm just mentioning this because I'm about to talk about this in the pathology. So the reason that it's particularly interesting to look at ovarian cancer is that, as Julian was illustrating earlier, cancers really aren't just one disease, and this is particularly the case for ovarian cancer. So as with most cancers, ovarian cancer has traditionally been divided into different subtypes depending on what they look like down a microscope to a pathologist. But there's increasing evidence recently that these tumours that look different down a microscope actually have different characteristic mutations and potentially different cells of origin. So, serous tumours, which are in the top left, look a bit like the lining of the fallopian tube, and there's increasing evidence that the high-grade serous cancers, which are by far the most common form of ovarian cancer, may arise from precursor lesions within the fallopian tube. So this is something known as serous tubal intraepithelial carcinoma, or a stick lesion. And this has completely revolutionised our idea about what ovarian cancer might be. And these tumours characteristically have mutations in the gene P53, which, as you know, is a tumour suppressor gene. For endometrioid tumours, bottom left, which look a bit like the endometrium lining the uterus, and clear cell tumours, bottom right, which have clear staining cytoplasm, there's increasing evidence that these tumours may arise from endometriosis, so deposits of tissue that looks like it should be in the uterus, but which is elsewhere in the pelvis. And endometriosis is a relatively common condition, and normally it can cause bad symptoms in terms of pain. It can be associated with infertility, but we don't normally think of it as being malignant. But there's a suggestion that in some women it may predispose them to getting these particular tumour types. And then for mucinous tumours, which are the top right and which look a bit like either the glandular part of the cervix or the lining of the gut, the origins of these tumours are a bit less clear, but again they seem to have slightly different characteristic mutations. Now, the reason I'm boring you with this pathology in the midst of a mostly epidemiological day is that if it's true that these different tumour types genuinely have different origins, then we might expect them also to have different risk factors. But that's something that you can really only look at in a very large study, because the vast majority of ovarian cancers are going to be high-grade serous tumours, and so in order to look at risk factors for these less common subtypes, which we think might be quite different, you really do need a very large study, which is why the Million Women study is so invaluable. So what did we find with tubal ligation? 22% of our cohort had had tubal ligation at a median age of 35. And overall, we found that women who'd had this surgery had a 20% reduction in their relative risk of ovarian cancer. And this is very much in line with results from other studies. But what's really interesting is when you start looking at it by tumour subtype. So again, we've got a forest plot. Our relative risk is on the left and blobs is on the bottom, and blobs on the left mean that women with tubal ligation have a lower risk. So, as we can see, for all ovarian cancer, there's a 20% reduction in risk, of relative risk, for women who've had a tubal ligation. But it's particularly interesting when you look by subtype. So for serous tumours, which are our most common group overall, there's about a 16% reduction in risk. But this is significantly different for the low-grade and the high-grade tumours, which we now think are not merely on the same continuum, but are quite different diseases. So for the high-grade serous cancers, which are the ones that we think might come from the fallopian tube, there's a 20% reduction in risk. Whereas for the low-grade tumours, which we don't think come from the fallopian tube, or at least not in the same way, there's no association. With endometrioid and clear cell tumours, which you remember are the ones we think might come from endometriosis, the relative risk is about halved in women who've had a tubal ligation compared to women who haven't. Now, you can see that the blobs are a lot smaller. These are much less common conditions. But it's still really significant for helping us to understand where are these tumours coming from. Because while these epidemiological results cannot prove that these new hypotheses are true, they are really interestingly consistent with them. In that if we are thinking that the high-grade serous cancers might come from the fallopian tube, then it perhaps makes sense that if you're doing surgery to cut or disrupt the fallopian tube, that the cancers that come from there might be reduced. Similarly, with endometriosis, we don't fully understand how it develops, but one of the most popular hypotheses is that endometrial cells from the uterus pass through the fallopian tubes and then can be deposited within the pelvis on the surface of organs. And so again, it might make sense that if we're doing surgery that blocks the fallopian tubes, that might help to block the passage of endometrial cells or maybe other things, and so reduce the risk of those subtypes. And so that's really interesting research in terms of helping us trying to understand whether these new hypotheses are true. And then for mucinous tumours, where we're not quite sure where they're from, but we don't think they're from the tube or from endometriosis, there's no association at all. We've also developed this work a bit further by saying, well, if we think that tubal ligation is associated with risk of ovarian cancer, what are the associations with other cancer types, and can that also help us to understand the etiology of ovarian cancer? So we've done another analysis to look at the relative risk of a whole range of different cancers amongst women with versus without tubal ligation. In the interest of time, I'm just going to highlight the most interesting result. So this is looking at cancers of the ovary, but also cancers of the fallopian tube and cancers of the peritoneum. So there's a thin layer sort of lining the abdomen and pelvis, which is the peritoneum. And the most common form of cancer in the fallopian tubes and in the peritoneum are high-grade serous cancers. So that they look the same down the microscope as the most common form of ovarian cancer. And they're now often managed in the same way, and many people are saying perhaps those serous tubal intraepithelial carcinomas that we think may be the precursor lesion for the most common form of ovarian cancer may also be the precursor lesion for these other cancers. And so what we find is that women who've had a tubal ligation not only have their 20% reduction in risk of ovarian cancer, but also have a similar magnitude of reduction in risk of the peritoneal cancers and also a substantial reduction in risk of fallopian tube cancers. Now, obviously, these cancers are much less common, so we've got small blobs and very wide confidence intervals, but they're still statistically significant. And so this is suggesting that it's at least consistent that it might be that these tumour types have a similar origin because their risk factors appear to be similar. And then we've published this work in the International Journal of Cancer and the British Journal of Cancer earlier this year. So just to conclude, we've confirmed in the Million Women study that women with a tubal ligation have a reduced risk of cancers of the ovary, fallopian tube and peritoneum, and that the ways that these associations vary by subtype, particularly for ovarian cancer, are consistent with these new hypotheses of the origins of the ovarian cancer subtypes, potentially in the fallopian tubes and endometriosis.